Explainability is also a core area within our Fairness, Transparency, and Accountability Research Initiative, specifically related to both the transparency and accountability prongs. So our work in this space is motivated by the idea that many have seen explainable machine learning as a potential way of opening up the black box of machine learning algorithms and thus enabling explanations that can provide more transparency for various stakeholders and also create feedback loops around accountability. Our work in this space, however, has suggested that current techniques don't necessarily adequately enable practitioners to provide explanations to a wide variety of stakeholders. And so our work in this space has taken on a few stages. First, we worked to map out what the current practice is. Next, we are in the process of reviewing relevant literature in this space, and then we'll be working with partners on developing a framework for tailoring explanations for specific stakeholders and contexts. So to that first stage, we conducted an interview-based project last year where we interviewed over 20 organizations to see how they were using explainability techniques in deployment. And one of the major findings from this paper was that in practice, explainability is often used by internal stakeholders such as machine learning developers in order to debug their models rather than being presented externally to provide greater transparency for end users. And our paper mapped out some of the reasons for this. And so we presented this both at the FATSTAR 2020 conference and also at the HCML workshop at NERPS 2019. So given that gap that we saw based on that initial project, this gap between the goals of explainability towards transparency and accountability and the practice, which is a little bit more oriented towards model development, we organized a convening which we called Explainable AI Day, where we brought together a wide variety of stakeholders, including explainability researchers, practitioners, policymakers, and civil society organizations, with the goal of identifying what are the problems where explainability might be able to offer interesting and helpful solutions, what are the relevant stakeholders, and what are the gaps in terms of what we would need to see from research or implementation in order for explainability to reach these goals. And based on this convening, we put out a paper that summarized a lot of the insights that we gained and that we then presented at a few workshops. Ongoing work in this space includes a project where we were working with a variety of partners to put together an interdisciplinary literature review about the role of uncertainty as explanation. So given that a key part of machine learning algorithms is the uncertainty implicit in them, how do we go about uncertainty communication, quantification, and communication in a way that can enable greater transparency? In addition, as I mentioned earlier, we are working to develop a framework for how to tailor explanations to the specific needs of particular contexts and stakeholders. So that is a project that we are currently scoping, and we'll be working closely with partners to build out those recommendations and that framework. So next up, Umang Bhatt, who is a research fellow at PAI, will be talking more about this work that we've been doing in the explainability space. And in addition to being a research fellow at PAI, Umang is a PhD student in machine learning at Cambridge University.
Hi there, my name is Umang. I'm a research fellow here at the Partnership on AI, and I work on explainability. About a year and a half ago, I joined Partnership on AI to start their explainable machine learning research agenda within the Fairness, Transparency, and Accountability Initiative. Over the last year and a half, we've made a lot of progress, and there's a lot of interesting projects on the horizon. So at the end of Q2 of 2019, we decided that we wanted to launch an interview study to understand how the how our partners across the partnership are actually using explainable machine learning. So we conducted that study in Q3 of 2019, and then we ended up running a multi-stakeholder convening that kind of answered some of the open problems from that interview study earlier in 2020 in February in New York City, aligned with XXAI. Right now, we're working on some really exciting work on uncertainty as a form of transparency, conducting a literature review with multiple partners. And then in early next year, we're planning on running a multi-stakeholder study to establish a framework for how explanations should be used in practice. That's a whirlwind of a timeline to tell you a little bit about what the Partnership on AI is working on with respect to explainable machine learning, but I'd like to dive a little bit deeper into each of these to give you a little sense of the flavor of the work we like to do here at the Partnership on AI with respect to explainability. The interview study we conducted last year had three major findings. One, that explainability is primarily used for debugging internally at a lot of major technical corporations. Two, the goals of explainability are not necessarily clearly defined within technical corporations or within civil society organizations. And three, the technical limitations of explainability actually make explainability hard to deploy in real time. Here's a link to the paper, and feel free to check it out and reach out if you have any questions, and we have a lot more details in the paper. But what all three of these findings left a large distaste in our mouth with respect to the explainability work that's currently being done in practice. As a result, we ended up hosting a multi-stakeholder convening to bring together explainability experts to study and understand why is explainability not necessarily being used in practice, though the research agenda is quite prolific in the machine learning community. So earlier this year, we held XAI Day, a multi-stakeholder convening, and we brought together 33 participants from 5 countries, 15 ML experts, 3 designers, 6 legal experts, and 9 policymakers. Their domain expertise varied from finance, healthcare, media, and social services in different government organizations. And our goal was to facilitate an inter-stakeholder conversation around explainable machine learning. What are some of the open challenges? Why is explainable machine learning not being deployed in practice? Basically trying to dig a little bit deeper into the findings from our interview study run the previous year. So some of our takeaways, there were 2 major takeaways from this convening. The first is that there's a need for community engagement in the development of explainable machine learning. And 2, that there are nuances in the deployment of explainable machine learning. And I'd like to leave you with open questions and problems with respect to both of these takeaways. So with respect to community engagement, the participants in the convening actually were able to highlight some salient problems with the current explainable machine learning research agenda. The first is that there's no sense of context in which explanations will be used. And what I mean by that is that a lot of the research community tends to develop explanations for machine learning algorithms without thinking about how they're going to be used. And in particular, can we leverage the context of deployment to learn better explanations? Once we understand the context of an explanation, the question comes down to how do we evaluate that explanation, both quantitatively and qualitatively. We had a lot of participants actually tell us that a lot of their human subject experiments with explanations never gave positive results. And a lot of the quantitative evaluation criteria were quite heuristic. So it's not necessarily clear how explanations should be evaluated, and which we're hoping that the machine learning community can help tackle this problem. The third takeaway with respect to community engagement is how can we prevent data misuse and preferential treatment by involving affected groups in the machine learning development process? One of the things that folks realized is a lot of the affected groups who are the affected groups of machine learning systems might not necessarily know that they have access to an explanation. And more importantly, if they don't know they have access to an explanation, then how are they supposed to act based on the explanation? So in the case of apartment rental applications, one participant noted that some participants might know the recourse actions they need to take in order to be approved for renting a particular apartment, while other participants from perhaps less privileged groups who are not working with brokers might not be able to access that information? How do we prevent this preferential treatment with respect to explainability? And the fourth and final takeaway with respect to community engagement was, how do we educate some basically internal data scientists and external stakeholders with regards to the functionality and the limitations of explainable machine learning? In many cases, a lot of external stakeholders do not know that they even have access to an explanation, and internal stakeholders attempt to over-index on the functionality of an explanation. They attempt to prescribe a lot more, perhaps even causality, onto the explanations that are resulting from a machine learning system. So all in all, these are 4 open problems, open questions in the machine learning community that came out of the convening that we held. So the second takeaway was on how to improve. There are a lot of nuances with deploying explainable machine learning. And some open questions here include, how does the uncertainty in the model, and perhaps even in the explanation technique, affect the resulting explanation? If my model is quite uncertain in doing prediction on a particular point, then is the explanation even valid, or is it even trustworthy? Number 2 is, how do stakeholders interact with the explanation? What if your explanation is providing you with information and perhaps exposes a spurious correlation in your data, and a spurious correlation that your model has picked up? How does a stakeholder go in and actually fix that? So can explanations actually become a conduit for interacting with your model? Number 3 is, how, if at all, how will the stakeholder behavior change as a result of the explanation that's shown? In many cases, if a lot of participants are shown the same explanation and are asked to take a particular course of action and perform recourse in a particular way, stakeholder behavior is probably going to change. And this leads us to our 4th takeaway, which is, over time, how are the explanation techniques and the models themselves going to adapt to those changes in stakeholder behavior? So we have lots of examples of this in our paper, and feel free to check that out and provide us with additional insight if you have any. We were most excited by this idea of, how does uncertainty affect explainable machine learning deployment? As such, we're currently conducting a literature review with 11 individuals from 5 partner organizations to study how uncertainty can be treated as a form of transparency. In particular, we're thinking about how can uncertainty be used for augmenting expert decision-making, building more trustworthy systems, improving your model performance, and decreasing model unfairness. We're leveraging the uncertainty literature from various domains, including visualization, human-computer interaction, machine learning, and core AI research, which is focused on uncertainty in planning and reasoning for decades. In doing this literature review, we're hoping to provide concrete open problems for our partner community and the broader AI field to tackle. In the more long-term horizon, we're planning on running a multi-stakeholder study, really to understand how transparency can be deployed in practice. In particular, we're interested in, what is the form of transparency that is required by a particular stakeholder in a particular domain for a specific model. And what we mean by this is that the level and form of transparency for a loan applicant and a compliance team member may differ. The form of that explanation might, for the loan applicant, might be a recourse explanation, but the compliance team member might need some global explanation of how the model behaves. So we're scoping out and establishing the project direction in this upcoming quarter. Please do reach out if you have any questions and would like to learn more and get involved. All in all, thank you for listening, and please do reach out if you're interested in our ongoing explainability work. My email address is here, and I'm looking forward to hearing all of your thoughts.